All right, we're going. Got it.
Okay.
I'll tell you
Nice streaming.
10 seconds. And the intro. Good evening and welcome to the After Hours show. I'm Joe in Norway. I'll be your cook for this evening. We're the Autonomous Collective. One of our esteemed colleagues here is Ann Lee, retired college professor and community member of the Daily Kos. He's a member of the National Council of Independent Scholars and is a contributor to the book, The Political Economy of Art, Making the Nation of Culture. Evening, Ann.
Hey there. Hi, Joe.
Hey. Well, I hope your Thanksgiving burrito came out well yesterday.
uh, Salad and burrito was my Thanksgiving dinner.
Well, there's in Norway there isn't Thanksgiving, of course, but I do tend to make one dish for my mother, her stuffing, which I thought I might do. So I'm going to continue my trad ways from last week. We did traditional Norwegian. Now we're going to do a traditional, I guess, can you say traditional American stuffing? I don't know. We'll see.
Well,
Uh,
there must be a whole variety of, a whole range of
it depends on the
international
region.
stuffings.
Hmm. Yeah, so basically what I'm going to do, I got most of the ingredients here. I've got a lot of wilted stuff. We're out at the farm, so I don't really have all of the ingredients to do it the way my mom did, but we'll mimic it. I've got a lot of wilted parsley, some stale uh, white bread, some half-rotted celery. I got an onion, and the main ingredient for me, anyways, since I was a kid, and probably one of the reasons why I got into cooking in the first place was basically I love slicing mushrooms, especially
Yeah.
for Thanksgiving, because there'd just be mountains of them to do. So you just get really good and focused. It's always the most enjoyable part. Typically, my mom will also use sage, fresh marjoram, and parsley, and then butter and chicken stock. I don't have sage or marjoram, but I did come across some Moroccan or Berber rosemary. It's a little thinner and smaller than regular rosemary. So I thought I could grind that up because it's similar profile to the sage. That's basically what I got to work with. And then another little sacrilegious thing to add garlic. Mom never used garlic.
Yeah.
But I'm going to get to prepping here. And I've asked Nancy if she could read an article on some activism that's been going on in Norway regarding the carnage taking place in Gaza at Israel's hand. And maybe we could have a little discussion about that. So, Nancy, you on hand by chance?
Yes, I'm absolutely here, ready to read. I'll begin. This is titled Activists from the Palestine Committee Campaigned Against Norges Bank. On Thursday morning, activists from the Palestine Committee blocked the entrance to Norges Bank as a protest against the oil fund's investments. The more than 50 activists prevented employees from coming to work. The message was clear: closed doors for war profiteers. When Dagsavisen was outside Norges Bank on Thursday morning, there was a tactful shout. Tang here, children in Gaza are dying. The background for the action is the management of the oil fund, which is led by Nikolai Tangen. The Palestine Committee believes the fund has invested in an arms industry that makes money from or contributes to war crimes in Gaza. Money flows into the oil fund. The oil fund should disinvest from these companies and end the arms embargo by Israel, says Kjell Stefansson, spokesperson for the Palestine Committee to Dagsavisen. The oil fund is heavily involved in the American arms industry, and for every day the war lasts, money flows into the oil fund. We have to put an end to that, he says. The committee has carried out a survey which shows that the oil fund has invested over NOK 37.8 billion.
Yeah, so that's a Norwegian crown. NOK. And NOK is Norwegian crown.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the oil fund has invested over 37.8 billion in companies which they believe are profiting from the Gaza conflict. One example they cite is the oil fund's investment of 15.2 billion NOK in the American arms company RTX, formerly known as Raytheon, which has sold missiles, bombs, fighter aircraft parts, and weapon systems to the Israeli military. It's no use talking nicely to people. We have sent a letter to the Ethics Council with a list of companies associated with the American or Israeli arms industry. We then hope that the finance minister or the finance committee at the Storting will address this, he says.
The Storting is the parliament. The Norwegian parliament. So, right.
Yes. Stefansson also wanted to hand over the letter in physical form, but no one from Norges Bank wanted to meet him during Thursday's action, he says. Is closing the entrance to Norges Bank the right way to campaign? We have to shout in capital letters. It's no use talking nicely to people, says Stefansson. The police were notified just ahead of the action and arrived at the scene shortly after the main entrance to Norges Bank was blocked. They informed Dagsavisen that they were not going to remove the protesters, which was not done either. Bank employees managed to get into the building by entering via Finanstilsynet further down the street.
Perfect.
At 10, it doesn't say 10 what, it just says at 10. I guess
Well,
maybe.
that is because we are on military time. We don't use the AM PM.
Okay, but I guess it's 10 in the morning. The campaigners left the scene, followed by the police. No people were arrested or detained during the action, which proceeded peacefully. Supports changes to the oil fund's investments. SV says in a statement that they stand behind the Palestine Committee's message during the campaign. The party has stated in its program that the oil fund's investments should not contribute to occupation or other violations of international law. They also want to pull the oil fund out of all the arms industry, including companies that only produce components for weapons systems. It is completely unacceptable to invest in companies that contribute to violations of humanitarian law. In Gaza, more children have been killed in 1 month than in all wars and conflicts in the whole world combined last year. It should be a wake-up call for the Ethics Council and Norges Bank, says Kari Elizabeth Koski, spokesperson for financial policy at SV. So, Joe, what is SV?
SV is center-left party, so kind of like liberals.
Okay.
I guess maybe what the Democratic Party would be if they were actually on the left.
Okay. Norway must use all the means we have to stop this bestial war. The oil fund is the world's largest government fund. A withdrawal will be noticed and will put a lot of pressure on the Israeli authorities, she adds. So that's the end of the article.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let's turn down the. Yeah, so there's basically coordinated acts of resistance taking place all over the world. We have a kind of special situation with this state fund, which is quite massive. It's let me see my notes here. Where was it?
So did you want me to read the demands of the Palestine Committee of Norway?
Yeah. Oh, yes, if you could.
Okay. Demand 1. The oil fund profits from the massacres in Gaza. The oil fund has investments of 37.8 billion in the international arms industry, which supplies Israel with arms. These are weapons that are used to carry out mass murders on the civilian population of Gaza. In addition, the oil fund has shareholdings worth 7.8 billion in the arms industry, which cooperates with Israeli arms manufacturers. Can you give us an idea how 7.8 billion, is it krona? Is that the name
Kroner,
of the money?
It's Norwegian crowns. So I believe it's 12 crowns to the dollar now.
So 7.8 billion would be somewhat less than a billion,
yeah.
Anyway, okay. So examples of such arms manufacturers are Raytheon, RTX, General Electric, General Dynamics, L3 Harris, I don't know this word, talus or thales and Rheinmetall, which are among the 25 largest arms manufacturers in the world. Demand 2, the oil fund must follow its own ethical rules. The Norwegian oil fund's ethics rules state that, quote, observation or exclusion can be decided for companies where there is an unacceptable risk that the company contributes to or is itself responsible for gross or systematic violations of human rights, serious violations of individuals' rights in war or conflict situations, sale of weapons to states in armed conflicts that use the weapons in a way that constitutes serious and systematic violations of the rules of international law for the conflicts, unquote. The oil fund breaks its own rules when it invests in the arms industry. 3, arms embargo against Israel. International human rights organizations have documented that war crimes are taking place with Israel's attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza. On the 16th of November, 32 UN experts made a call to the international community to prevent genocide against the Palestinian people. They also recommend the business community and say, quote, the international community, including both states and non-state actors, such as the business community, must do everything they can to immediately avert the risk of genocide being committed against the Palestinian people, unquote. One of the measures they highlight is an arms embargo against the warring parties. Amnesty International makes the same demand. We encourage the oil fund to support the demand for an arms embargo in line with the rules not to contribute to armed conflicts that use weapons in a way that constitutes serious and systematic violations of the rules of international law for conflicts. That's the end.
Yeah, so I'm generally not hopeful, but in this case, I feel even though they weren't able to get the letter there, they weren't able to get any contact with the Norges Bank. There is a great potential for change based on the charter for the fund and all of that, and the fact that Norway kind of prides itself on being one of the more moral and ethically responsible nation states out there. Might be a little naive, but they have typically gone under the radar with their funding for, let's say, questionable businesses, whether it's weapons industry or fossil fuel industry. There is a major shift for trying to get the whole country off of petrol-based cars, which next year will be the last. No more petrol cars, and next year, I believe it is. And you'll only be able to buy used ones, not new ones. So there's all of these focus on the environment and kind of at least putting on airs that they're being responsible. So this will, if the very least, it'll shame the banks, and this obvious genocide going on in Gaza makes it absolutely undeniable their ties because of their investments in these various companies, and then the violation of their charter, basically. So I'm kind of hopeful, and the oil fund is it's one of the hugest, if not the biggest, fund out there in the world. But, Not sure if anyone has any comments or questions.
Well, it is, it's a good example of how, not unlike the Middle East, if you have a concentrated extraction industry like fossil fuels, which for Norway has been, the result of drilling in the North Sea, among other places, and it's been a boon on the one hand. On the other hand, the advantage is that it's a single fund. But the oil, it's important to note that the oil market is incredibly complicated, and making an impact, I think would be, is certainly possible, and it's important for individual countries and nation states to make these kinds of moves to highlight the problem.
Apparently in 1996, they generated a new fund, the pension fund, where they're channeling all of the revenue they make off of their investments into another kind of fund. But another local action I heard about was in Barcelona. The city of Barcelona has now severed ties with Israel based on the attacks. So everywhere around the world, we've got these positive activist actions going on, and we just have to keep up we have to be persistent.
Yes, and it is about pressure, and it is about trying to emphasize how integrated, unfortunately, some institutional funds are. In other words, if you have an oil fund, there are always partners in some of these things. I think there's a partnership between Scotland and Norway, for example. So some of the financial arrangements are always much more complicated.
We need some place to refine that crude.
Well, as I was pointing out a while back, it is about refineries. It's not so much about drilling. It really is more about the distribution of the global distribution of refineries and the types of oil, the types of products that come from various oils. Some oils make better things, in terms of chemistry. So that's another issue as well. But these things should be paid attention to at the global level. And the United States certainly doesn't do that relative to Raytheon.
I didn't know they renamed themselves. When was that?
Fairly recently, actually.
Blackwater?
Well, it's similar to that, but it's also to coordinate its international finance. That is in terms of the product itself. And it's just it's capitalism. The thing in Israel is that the electronics are a little bit more complicated because, for example, Israel doesn't just use Raytheon, but a whole variety of other products, and they're fairly a wide mix of electronics. They have, for their new F-35 fighters, they have their own set of electronics for them. For I assume for security reasons in some ways, but that's kind of how they operate.
Well, just an update on the cooking here. I'm sweating the mushrooms. That'll basically, you slice them up, put them in a pot, the lid, high temperature. They'll sweat all the moisture out, and then that'll evaporate back into the mushroom, or evaporate, and then it'll concentrate the flavor, and then you can season, and then I'll add those into the sauteing. You don't have to cook it very much, the onion and celery, because it'll bake in the oven for about, depends on how much moisture you have, but 35 minutes to an hour. So that's where we stand here. I'm going to slice up the bread, and then we'll put over in the oven. But if you wanted to catch us up on Ukraine, I assume is
Okay.
next.
Okie dokie. I'm hungry again. Darn it. Let me. Kelly will occasionally flash up an image of one kind or another. I usually just remind us that we've had another week of warfare in Ukraine. The weather has changed, and the soil has gotten muddy. There's mud everywhere. There has little bits of snow. It's cold weather, and there has been a variety of conversations about who is going to be the aggressor. And the usual kinds of things to fill in the space have occurred. Russian domestic politics are also quite weird. Today or yesterday, President Putin decided to pardon several, and it is several now, as has been reported, criminals who were serving time in prison for cannibalism and murder. They've been pardoned to join the Russian military. So you're going to have this is not really a new thing. I mean, of course, they have been they've been using the prison populations to populate the military, and largely in the group in the northeastern part of the front, which was dominated by the Wagner corporate private military corporation. But there are other private military corporations as well. And of course, Wagner had many of its people integrated into the regular Russian military structure. That is where most of the casualties are coming still. Casualties did go up. There's a slight reporting on that it exceeded 1,000 in the last couple of days. That has yet to be verified, but that's one element of what's happening in Ukraine. So the top, the one that you can see there, that kind of reddish area above on the upper side is kind of the general front where Wagner was before, and where the Ukrainians made a fairly large recovery of territory. But as many people have pointed out, there are probably 10 to 20 different skirmishes that go on all along this line, the western line here, with some, as we pointed out last week, some new advances on the lower left near Kherson, where something like 5 to 8 kilometers of progress has been made by Ukrainian military forces. It is the cold weather. Yes.
And did I hear you say cannibals?
Yes, cannibals. These are the one guy I did a little thing that I posted from it. The reporting has been that a very eastern oblast or state in the federated the Russian Federation had this guy and his brother. I think they happen to have a thing for killing and eating people, and they're not the only cannibals too. This seems to be a much wider phenomenon. We get
are they being chosen because they pack light and don't need all those MRIs?
Yes, indeed. No, they're just criminals, and the crimes that they've been convicted of course, there are the families of those people who got at are quite upset about this whole business. This is why it's been a thing in social media. You can imagine all the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, sort of being annoyed by putting Jeffrey Dahmer in the military as opposed to Jeffrey Dahmer going to prison where he got killed by another prisoner. Apparently, you could be a cannibal and not, get killed in prison or whatever. The whole story of, I think, a Russian prison, the Russian penal system is, of course, very complicated and problematic, as we've pointed out before, with people who, for doing very small anti-war actions, get multiple years in prison, as we pointed out last week. So yes, there is more than one cannibal that has been. I think one managed to actually serve their entire 6-month tour for Wagner, and was subsequently arrested again after he killed some more people, civilians, after he got out. It's a very strange situation. Often it seems like, reading a Dostoevsky or something, that the kind of brutality in that sense. But, cannibalism does exist across an unfortunate number of societies. It's just that they don't quite get in the U.S., we like thinking that we don't have these things, but in fact, I think we do. It's just not as sensationalized, I think, as it is in the Russian context. So that's one thing. And of course, it has gotten a fair amount of amplification in Russian social media. The Finns continue to block the border in terms of letting people, migrants, etc., into Finland from Russia. Some of it is just simply a lot of it is paperwork problems, but the Finns have decided to constrict movement across the border. They've done some restriction of automobiles. There are people on bicycles trying to get across the border. I'm sure there are people, sort of trudging through some fairly dense snowy areas to try and get into Finland. And it's a porous border with respect. So that's and a lot of people were very used to doing a lot of things crossing the border fairly regularly, not unlike our southern border. So that's part of it. Other side elements are that the head of Belarus claims that he's not going to support any invasion from Belarus into Ukraine, which, we'll believe it when we see it, considering that the initial attack on Kyiv came from Belarus. So that's an interesting recent development. I talked before about the Poles providing all kinds of crazy stuff, because the Poles have a very substantial military buildup to protect themselves. So other than cannibalism, there was more discussion of military hardware and software. There have been attacks across the line, with the usual kind of missile attacks on all kinds of things. Today there was a news item suggesting that Russia was going to build a tunnel between Crimea and Russia, probably because they're always worried about the Kerch Bridge. And a couple of weeks ago, when some ships were attacked in the dry dock near the bridge, the Kerch Bridge, they sort of overreacted and did all kinds of countermeasures, including that one of the things they do, aside from marshaling forces, is to create huge smoke screens around the Kerch Bridge. The Kerch Bridge hasn't been hit recently, but of course it's incredibly vulnerable, and more time has been spent sending drones against the is weakening the air defenses that are located in Crimea. So that's one thing. The recent news is that grain is now being shipped more regularly using that very tight coastal route near Odessa and also near the mouth of the Danube River. And so that's the Ukrainian economy is picking up a little bit on that score. The other thing, of course, as we mentioned last week, was the Russians playing fast and loose with hulls, tanker hulls carrying Russian crude oil, and so that continues on. As I said, with the weather change, there's going to be some waiting until the ground freezes. So, in other words, the ground is pretty soft at the present moment, and it does restrict certain types of vehicles. And so tonight, I'm putting up a little thing on that's a commentary from a variety of folks talking about the difference between using wheeled vehicles and tanks. And I know if that seems a little tedious, but it's a big deal to the armies involved. That is, whether tanks solve certain issues or whether wheeled vehicles, which do get stuck in the mud a lot easier, are going to be used. Now, what that means, of course, from a ground combat point of view, is that artillery is going to be used more. There's a recent report saying that the Russians are now going back to using, are now dipping into 1950s stocks of artillery weapons, so that they're beginning to run, have shortages of things, or they also are not utilizing, they're saving some of the most modern pieces of equipment that for whatever other contingencies that will occur. Other things that are going on is training of a variety of things relative to helicopters and airplanes and all that, the usual stuff. The Ukrainians made a big deal this week of achieving a sniper shot, a fatal sniper shot at 3.8 kilometers. It's the last record was set in 2017 by a Canadian sniper in Afghanistan. These are not your average rifles. These are large, above 50 caliber. They're fairly large, like an anti-tank gun. But 3.8 kilometers is quite a distance, and they captured it on video. It's a fairly interesting thing. Probably more interesting to aficionados of small arms. But yeah, that's sort of what's going on now. A variety of military actions that range from an increase in trucks being hit because of the movement of troops around, because of this, as I said, in Kherson, which is on the lower left of the image, there is infiltration onto what's called the left side of the Dnieper River. There are only a couple of bridges still working. There's pontoon bridges. They're trying to. It's still about logistics and movement of artillery, and trying to. And still, it appears as if the Russians are not seriously reinforcing certain elements in that region. Although they have built up protection of certain key cities like Tokmak and I think Melitopol. So those are things that they're worrying about. But in terms of winter and spring warfare, I think that there's going to be waiting until the ground freezes up a little bit more. You'll see generally lots of skirmishing and strange artillery attacks. There were a bunch this morning in the northern part up near Kharkiv. They've been attacking places they haven't attacked before with artillery. On other sides, strange side notes is they have a archive or a library of seeds for the various crops in Ukraine. It used to be in Kharkiv. They've just moved it somewhere, and they won't tell us. They won't say where they moved it to, but they're the core groups of seeds for crops is now somewhere else and not so close to the war zone. And so that's also, these are little side interesting things.
Maybe they arranged with the Norwegians to send it to Svalbard.
Oh yeah, perhaps. It is interesting to see that they are, of course, protecting all of these kinds of things relative to the economy. A couple of farmers got blown up by mines recently because they were working the fields for a while, so that's another issue. Lots of strange little things happen in that way. The count from the British Ministry of Defense is that something like 11,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped or relocated into Russia. So much so that a member of the Duma actually managed to work out getting one of these adoptions from an area that was taken over in the initial invasion, and so he adopted a Ukrainian child, and it was somehow leveraged that he would adopt one of these children. So there's a famous one of the 11,000 that have been forcibly relocated into Ukraine. Now the numbers, as many people died in Ukraine since the initial invasion as died in a month, civilians in the month that the Israel-Gaza war has been operating. So if you want to see, some people get annoyed when you make a comparison like that, but that's exactly it. Something like 10 to 12,000 Ukrainian civilians have died, and similarly in Gaza, you have a similar kind of death toll, but happening over a much quicker amount of time. The wars are not identical in that sense, but they're, of course, they're still being leveraged against each other in the U.S. Congress. There's still a sticking point about getting the large Ukraine support bill. The GOP is trying to still holding it up, so that's another story that is in there. But millions of dollars in military hardware is still being transferred. Another 100 million, I think, was transferred just the last week. So that's the other part of this little thing, this little war. Putin is doing what he's doing, and the internal situation in Russia. There's some migration that suggests that there is a brain drain going on in Russia. A lot of people have fled to Europe, to the EU. So there is some effect there, but it hasn't been that big an effect. And of course, the Russians have increased the amount of money they've devoted to supporting this war, despite the fact that they're doing, not a very competent job of it. It's just it's interesting to see how that's working. I think you're going to see different ways of doing warfare over the next coming months, as we saw in the two prior winters. Remember that the war started in late February of 22, and so this past winter featured a certain set of kinds of approaches to doing war when the ground is both soft and hard. And so you can see some of those elements operating there. The technology hasn't changed that much. There still are drones on both sides. the use of a kind of swarming drone attacks is becoming more consistent in each application. So that's important as well. So
how much does winter warfare change regarding trench warfare in the winter versus the summertime?
It's actually well, depending on how frozen, how cold it is, those are important issues. What you're doing mainly is rotating more troops through, because it is kind of it's really oppressive to do that. And attacks are much more complicated because, you're sort of always doing it against, these sort of entrenched areas. The mapping of the trench areas is fairly obvious now. So one would assume that both sides, primarily the Ukrainians, have figured out what the weak points are and are beginning to exploit those a little bit more effectively. And of course, the Russians have this other problem. They haven't released figures about how the annual conscription did, but I do not think that they did as well. Hence the mention of still using prisoners to fight battles, at least in part of their operations. Partisan activity sort of cranked up a little bit. The bombings of various local officials occurred recently. They assassinated a couple of mayors or other folks. They've been doing some things that are much more terrorizing. After the Russians hit a military ceremony of the Ukrainians and killed about 25 people, the Ukrainians decided to fight back and bombed a Russian military celebration, killing about an equal number. So it has that degree of kind of brutality at work on both sides. The Germans, you were mentioning Rheinmetall relative to the big corporations that are locked into Norwegian finance, and Rheinmetall is probably the largest arms supplier in the EU in Europe, and they make everything. I mean, significantly, they make a ton of ammunition for artillery ammunition, and drones and tanks. They make all of those things. It's really, with respect, not that different than, for example, Krupp and Thyssen of World War II, in terms of large steel companies, corporations in Germany. And there's been issues about whether the Germans are going to be forthcoming with certain pieces of hardware. There is a more long distance drone that the Germans make that is actually supposed to be a very good one, but they're hesitating in providing it to the Ukrainian army for all the usual political reasons, and that's sort of at work. Otherwise, all the airplane stuff is pretty much the same. It's very strange, sort of drone activity among other kinds of surveillance stuff, which I think is just happening on a daily basis. They recently celebrated the fact that a country with no navy managed to sink 22 Russian ships. So that's always interesting. Just in general, in the history of this war, it will be shown that a country with not much of a navy to speak of managed to sink major assets of one of the larger global navies in the Black Sea. Let's see, what else? No, all the usual things are occurring. Sanctions regimes are continuing. The usual trouble in Western European democracies, or so-called democracies, are problematic as well, relative to Orban and a variety of other folks in terms of internecine sort of arguments about what finance is going where. And then, of course, the usual propaganda threats that include the usual evening Russian propaganda claiming that they're going to bomb everybody under the sun, which is sort of pretty much nonsense, but interesting always to see how that works. Because they constantly crank it out, and it is a function of hybrid warfare. There's a recent document that the Institute for the Study of War has done, talking about the hybrid warfare that the People's Republic of China is beginning to operate with relative to the Taiwan situation, which has always been percolating. And so that's the other thing. I think I've finished yakking about this sort of stuff. Should we talk about food for a moment?
Oh, sure. Oh, just a Taiwan issue. Did they point out what types of strategies they've been employing?
Well, there's a continuous kind of naval exercises, or the document talks a little bit more about the preparations for invading Taiwan have been, percolating for a while. The reality, or at least the way I read the report, was that they've calculated that it would be really devastating to try. They're not ready to do it. Anyone who would claim that they're ready to do it soon is really fooling themselves. They're in no way ready to invade Taiwan, and they know that, and they've calculated how badly it will go if they try to do it soon. So it is a much longer term sort of thing. And what they've adopted, because calling it hybrid warfare is to adopt essentially the Russian approach to war, which they've been doing all along. That is cyber attacks, propaganda, proxies, and these really sort of minor irritations that occur in the South China Sea, which they obviously have many sub issues going on with, the U.S. does little things that are not necessarily provocations, but they are necessary in diplomacy. That is to say that Biden, I think, recently expressed his support for the Philippines relative to this stuff. And, there are all these sort of sub issues that are going on with all of the people involved, the usual suspects, North Korea, Vietnam, etc. And of course the arming of Australia. Australia is actually a fairly major arms producer now. Not so much in terms of large capital kinds of munitions, but more in terms of that they make a lot of there's a lot of electronic devices that are coming out of Australia, as well as armored vehicles, not tanks, but other kinds of armored vehicles are actually making an appearance. There's a bunch of them that have been transferred to Ukraine, for example. And then of course, there's that whole thing about the submarines, the Virginia-class submarines that will be sold by the United States to Australia. Not mentioning, of course, that you can equip such submarines with nuclear weapons, but no one wants to talk. No one talks about that.
Indeed. Well, on the food front, we've got the stuffing in the oven, all loaded. So I think it will be just about done by the time you're finished with a rant. Did you say you have?
Yes, I do have a rant. That's a nice image there. I like that, the patterns that were coming from that. I might as well, I guess, do my little rant thing. If one goes to, I think I covered all the Ukrainian things. There's, the usual, Ukrainian stuff is that they just show how much Ukrainians can actually destroy all kinds of crazy Russian stuff. with their there's a lot of drone footage that comes out. It fortunately does not come in very quickly for a variety of reasons, partially because it's edited for propaganda purposes, but also, you can actually give away too much information by showing too much of it. So usually what you get is a little bit dated in terms of stuff getting blown up or whatever. Now, what I'm just going to rant about, speaking of munitions, is Kyle Rittenhouse. Some of you may or may not remember that at the age of 17, Kyle Rittenhouse, after the George Floyd demonstrations in Minneapolis, decided, and he's a wannabe cop. He was a police cadet. He's truly an aficionado of the police arts in that sense. And his interest, of course, included, wanting to get the nice standard sort of AR-15 pattern assault rifle. So, and he obviously was attracted to Trump et al. The point being that a variety of people who had gone to Minneapolis to agitate from a right-wing point of view, for example, Boogaloo Boys, which some people will claim have left-wing leanings, but they don't. They constantly claim it, but they don't. They're really, truly just simply, hangers on to a variety of Proud Boy, Oath Keeper activity. Mainly because a lot of them never served in the military, etc. Anyway, there were a bunch of them, 20 of them, I think, that announced they were going to protect property in Kenosha, Wisconsin, from rioters and people of color, because during the weeks after George Floyd, a guy who was having a domestic argument managed to get shot and paralyzed by a policeman. There has been a financial settlement and a variety of other things, but it's pretty clear when you look at, there was videotape and video and all that sort of stuff about it. But the fact is, of course, there was a public outcry and street demonstrations and things that were agitating, much like what had happened in Minneapolis. So Kyle Rittenhouse, just out of high school, I think he was in his last year of high school, he has a friend who lives in Wisconsin who is old enough to buy an AR-15 pattern assault rifle, modern sporting weapon, if you want to, modern sporting rifle, if you want to use the euphemism they use, buys it in some rural Wisconsin sporting goods store, stores it for Rittenhouse in Wisconsin. Rittenhouse lives in Illinois on the border of Wisconsin. So while this street action is occurring, Rittenhouse has his mother drive him to across the border to pick up his assault rifle, which he's not supposed to have, and is obviously, there is a weapons charge that should have been rendered, but in the prosecution of this, they decided to go for the whole enchilada, which probably wasn't a good idea. They should, if they were smart, they would have pleaded it down to some kind of manslaughter thing, and they would have probably gotten Rittenhouse into jail, or into prison. But of course, they went whole hog of first-degree intentional homicide or attempted intentional homicide and some other peripheral things after Rittenhouse, in this demonstration, so-called protecting gas stations and convenience stores. The Rittenhouse's pretext was that he was going there as a combat medic, which, it has its own mythology built into it as well. So anyway, in one of the evening events, confrontations are occurring all over the place. There's a variety of folks, some who are just people who want to cause trouble or mess with police or whatever. Some who are perhaps anarchists, perhaps others engaged in this, but it's certainly clear that there were armed right-wing folks who had a little thing, and they were, protecting property. And so Rittenhouse hangs out with these people and sort of presents himself as sort of being part of that crowd, and the police, telling us who their real allegiances are, allow this to happen. I mean, they, give water bottles to these, to these guys who are, protecting property or whatever. And Rittenhouse is part of this little group. Well, at some moment, things get out of hand and people get shot in a variety of instances. And Rittenhouse himself, because he's, whatever, out of control, managed to shoot 3 people, killing 2 people, one of whom was, either defending themselves or trying to stop him because he had his assault rifle and he'd already shot at least one person. One person is disabled from, his shooting, and the other 2 were killed directly. There's a lot of video for it. The thing about prosecuting this was that they made a big deal out of it because, some buildings did get burned down. Trump went for a photo op next to the one building that did burn down, making it appear as though the entire city had burned down, and that was clearly not the case. So anyway, all of those things were going on at once. And so ultimately, after a year of prosecution on a variety of, the crossing state lines, gun charges, a variety of other things, the trial goes forward and he's acquitted, which is promoted by Donald Trump. He actually has him to Mar-a-Lago. He now has a book coming out. I can't imagine a 20-year-old person having enough of a kind of experiential life story, particularly in this case, that deals with sort of resilience and survival. I just don't think that if you compare this to other actual war stories or other much more important kinds of moral events, I think really not quite the same thing. But anyway, Candace Owens promotes him and suggests that he should countersue the people, the family. I think it's the father of one of the people who died, is suing him with a wrongful death, I assume, for damages in civil court. The person whose bicep was blown off of one arm by Rittenhouse is also suing because he's now disabled. So there's other things going on, and Rittenhouse claimed he was, he's going to become a medical health professional, right? A male nurse, as they say. And all of these were kind of things to sort of prop up the contention that he was simply being beset by rioters and that he was defending himself. And right after he killed 1 or 2 of these, right after the event where he shot and killed one person, the police they just let him go by. It's just that, to me, that's the most amazing piece of video that you have there. Right after he shoots the 3rd person and kills him, he's walking there with his gun, and the police just, don't do a thing, which is quite fascinating. Anyway, he apparently is now broke, or at least his attorney says he's broke. I don't think so. I think he's actually probably got a little bit in the bank. and he's presented himself to a variety of places, like Tucker Carlson's Twitter cast or whatever, among other right-wing outlets. And he has this sort of whatever the George Zimmerman halo is, he has a very similar one, and he's much younger, of course, than George Zimmerman. So I think for many more decades, we're going to have Kyle as a kind of personality. It's unfortunate that he didn't try to join the military, or any kind of a thing that might have provided some sort of moral justification for his actions. So he still identifies with many of these sort of rump right-wing groups. And so I put a little thing in Daily Kos on that, and it includes a Jen Sorensen cartoon, which is about the kind of fear of people with assault rifles and guns and stuff. And the election is coming up, and it's unfortunate, but Kyle Rittenhouse is going to probably be featured in at least some of those rallies. And I think, if from a left-wing point of view, people should just always promote the counterfactual. Had a black 17-year-old cross state lines to arm himself with an illegally acquired assault rifle, attended a MAGA rally, picked a fight and shot 3 people, killing 2 of them. I think the trial, I agree that the trial probably would have been a formality, and then he'd be in prison for life. There's a similar a case. It's not identical, but a similar one where a black one could say that he's probably an Afrocentric activist, ran over somebody, and his prosecution, he had declared himself a sovereign citizen and a variety of other things, and he got the book thrown at him. This was in I think Milwaukee, generally around the same time. Unless you think that that's unimportant, the current senator, who's quite a dolt, what's his name, Johnson from Wisconsin, used this one other counterexample I was just mentioning, as an election promotion, the fear of black people sort of thing. So anyway, that's my little rant for the week.
Well, are you positing that we have a 2-tier justice system in the U.S.?
Oh, there are contingencies built into the legal system that unfortunately weigh in on certain intersectional differences.
Stuffing time.
I just can't imagine a 17-year-old black kid who would have done the exact same things, not doing a little prison time. I mean, the circumstances could be written as self-defense, but defending it, particularly in terms of people of color and at a particular moment in history, I don't think that would have happened.
Is he becoming more radicalized, or is he kind of just
Well,
the
I
same
don't think he's
behavior?
smart enough to be radicalized. I mean, he did some things that were just typical teenager stupidity during the time that he was on bail, etc. I don't think he has the kind of political consciousness to understand really what he's doing, and I think he's just another, useful idiot. I would actually expect him, relative to the people like what's his name, Maxwell Frost, and a variety of other folks, to run for political office at some moment. And as in Wisconsin, as we know, there's a lot of division. There's a significant right-wing, presence in Wisconsin, and I could see that he might actually, he could get elected. That would be really scary, but whatever.
I can see a future ticket with him and Q Shaman for
Oh, well, there you go.
presidency.
Pretty much the same. Well, at least the shaman was a vegetarian. I mean, or vegan. Rittenhouse, I think, has a fairly normal diet, non-vegetarian diet.
Few burgers, I assume.
Well, there's the story. There are a variety of intermediate stories of that he was on the speaking tour, and they took him to, standard fast food or type restaurants and diners and stuff like that. And the rounds that he's been making are at some of these kinds of rallies and conferences and things that nothing really major. And it will be interesting to see whether he this book thing is obviously a way to try and frame both rehabilitation, but also to give him enough money to fight these other lawsuits. But who knows? I mean, Zimmerman, the case of George Zimmerman has all those other similarities built into it.
Hmm. Well, I'm almost finished. I'm going to have to return this back to the oven. It's just not enough time for baking. But we've made my a version of my mother's stuffing. What do you call it? Dressing if it's not in the bird?
Well,
It's
yeah, I think it's still called.
anachronistic to call it
Well,
stuffing.
dress the kind of standard way of doing dressing these days is not to put it in the bird for health reasons, right? Some people don't cook it properly when it's in the bird.
Yeah, the risk of salmonella and undercooked bird, uncooked stuffing, uncooked bird. Not a good combination.
I think it's very tasty, particularly since one uses a lot of oil or butter in it, and it's always quite tasty. Are you having
when it's in the oven? You get the caramelization, the crispy bits as well that you miss when it's all soggy up in the bird.
I mean, I do think that there's some really interesting dressing poultry dressing recipes. The ones with oysters I've always thought were just interesting. Not that I've had them in many years.
I've not had oysters. Chestnuts is another popular.
Chestnuts, yes, indeed.
Well, I believe that is all we've got for today.
In less than 20 minutes, there'll be, yes, Twilight Zone. So folks should sort of hang in there as we make that little transition. I think our outro should come in fairly soon. Banner et al. Lots of other things happen here in the Autonomous Collective at theautonomouscollective.net. So you should come and join us. Make some presentations. Surely, and don't call me Shirley. You have something to share with us. We have a really wide range of folks who do other kinds of interesting things. For example, on Sunday, I'm going to yak about the economic and philosophical manuscripts of Marx from 1844. I know that's so exciting. But Columbo is on right after that.
Well, Shirley, since you should mention it, Valleyvox will be having a double bill, I believe. The first one is Airplane from 1980. Yes. And prior to that, Cameron will be showing a sports documentary on Yogi Berra, I believe his name is.
Yes, Yogi Berra, the former Yankees catcher who has it's the perfect example of how you can do informal logic using baseball. But there are writer workshops coming up. perhaps we will have one tomorrow and then one on Monday, and sports on Monday. And for me, I will be doing little this and that things on information, disinformation coming up. We have the short story hour on Tuesday. We'll be back to reading China or China Melville, a book on the Communist Manifesto on Thursday. We're very excited about that. It has such it's worth reading, not just the manifesto, but looking at it in such a close reading is still, I think, really important. There's going to be at some moment there's going to be a Wednesday movie night with certain wacky things. Either this week or next week, we're going to show the anime biography of Karl Marx done by the People's Republic of China. So it's a little strange.
So that's officially state sanctioned?
Oh yes, it's done by the propaganda ministry. It's
wow.
They were trying to make it, to popularize it for the younger generation. So it has that Japanese anime look. Marx looks like a K-pop guy.
Well, if we've got any early birds in the house and you want to join me out on the slopes, we've been having nonstop snow. So we got about by tomorrow, 2.5 feet of snow. So we may go skiing.
Yay. Some of us who live in snow country don't really like snow, but that's where it is.
Well, I grew up skateboarding, and I've never did cross country ski, but for years I've been trying to do it, but I have good balance, but apparently not when I'm on skis. I will be struggling.
Yes, cross country skiing. I'm just not coordinated enough to do it in a good way. Even though I find it actually quite interesting relative to biathlon. Anyway.
Oh, can I just mention?
Carry on.
Go ahead.
So Valley Vox tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time has a very special guest, Sandy Gimple, who just came out with a book. She's a stunt person.
Stunt woman.
Yes, and also I guess you'd say actor.
Yeah.
She has the distinction of being not only in the first Star Trek ever made, the original pilot, but the first episode of Star Trek to be aired.
And it actually appears in Airplane, which will be seen in Valley Vox.
Yes, very exciting stuff.
Very exciting. Okay, is it time to go? Yeah, we'll see you next week.